This is the toughest way that you can lose, in the playoffs. And certainly with the way we started the game, that's the team that I know that we're capable of being. And in the second half, we just didn't finish the game. This was a step for us, and we're going to grow a lot from it.
So quite confident of Brandon Staley to speak in that post-game interview as if he was going to be part of the growth of the team in the future, because I think that a lot of fans and a lot of NFL pundits are calling for his head at the moment. So let's take a deep dive into whether that would be the right move, the different directions that the Chargers management team can go from here, and give this game a little recap.
So like relax, I'm spilling these raps long as you feel them to the day that I drop.
Let's wind the clocks back a few months to the beginning of the season and a season preview done by a guy who definitely needs a haircut. It's too bad because injuries and coaching can really hold this team back. But if this team is healthy, they should be a force to be reckoned with. Now, I'm wrong about football a ton, but unfortunately that was not one of the times. And it's always beautiful to see when you have two things you're super worried about, and not only do they both come true, one of them comes true, Mike Williams' injury, as a result of the other, coaching decisions.
Is anybody surprised about what happened?
No.
Always makes the fan experience that much more enjoyable. I think a lot of Chargers fans would love to do the Lane Kiffin to Brandon Staley and Joe Lombardi and just leave them on the tarmac, not even let them on the plane back home. As harsh as that would be, the reality is a collapse like this, when you're up 20 points at the half, 27-0 at one point, and win the turnover battle in the game, a playoff game, 5-0. Winning a turnover battle by 5 and losing the game seems absolutely impossible, especially when you have a team that's as offensively talented as the Chargers are, and the fact that you were able to cash in on a few of those turnovers with touchdowns. This was, in fact, the first time that an NFL team lost a playoff game despite winning the turnover battle by 5 or more. So the Chargers, as usual, out here setting records, and not the good kind. To those long-suffering Chargers fans among us, it's not the craziest thing in the world, but it still makes us question, with the amount of talent that there was on this team this year, and in this game specifically, it makes you question how you can move forward with this coaching staff intact. And this game, unfortunately for Staley, was a dichotomy. It started off extraordinarily well, because he did a lot of the things that we talked about in the preview on this channel, like jamming the wide receivers, the line of scrimmage, making Lawrence hold the ball as a result longer than he wanted to, make multiple level reads, get a little confused by the zone defense that they disguised super well, and make interceptions, as the Chargers were able to do 4 times in the first half. Now, Lawrence obviously didn't play well. He missed some reads, etc., but the Chargers were a huge part of that, and Staley deserves more credit than anybody else for that specific level of strategy. And then in addition, if you look at the macro season the Chargers had, there is absolutely no doubt that they were here in this playoff game in the first round with an opportunity to move on to the divisional round because of Brandon Staley's defensive coaching. There was a point in the season where I think a lot of fans, other than maybe the most optimistic, thought it was probably not likely this team was going to be able to make a run to the postseason, and they actually were able to make such a run that the last week of the regular season actually meant nothing. The seeding was locked in. And unfortunately, that's where the positives end. As we see a lot of the time in coaching, especially in the NFL from half to half, Doug Peterson, an excellent offensive coach, made some adjustments. The Chargers, especially Asante Samuel, were sitting on the inside of routes in the first half, and it made it very difficult for Trevor Lawrence to fit it in. Now, in the second half, you saw Trevor Lawrence using his arm strength to get the ball outside, going deep a lot more. And despite the Jaguars' increasing offensive success, Staley made no adjustment to that adjustment. He is a defensive coach. He is there to call the defensive plays. That is the imprint he's supposed to leave on the team for the positive. And he made no consistent adjustments in the second half to what the Jaguars came out of the half doing. And as a result, the Jaguars did not punt in the second half. That is, in addition to the blown coverages, full-on unacceptable and can't be overlooked. And one of the most interesting parts of this game that had tons of interesting elements was that the football gods seemingly wanted to highlight Brandon Staley's mistake of playing his starters way too long in the game last week, once again, by having DeAndre Carter go out with an ankle injury and make it obvious that not only did the Chargers miss Mike Williams as a pure fact because of how good he is at football, but it's additionally detrimental because the Chargers' wide receiver depth is terrible. So it's additionally stupid to risk someone who's not only that good, but a wide receiver in a position of lack of depth in a game that means nothing. It was such a dumb move, and really, it might cost Staley his job, among other things. having a collapse this bad is obviously bad enough on its own under the bright lights of the playoffs. Winner take all, loser goes home. But it's just compounded by the fact that Staley was being questioned, and rightfully so, in the week leading up to the game. There was a tremendous amount of pressure on him coming in. And listen, sometimes coaches are fired in professional sports for reasons that are not legitimate. Sometimes it comes down and it's just not fair. Brian Flores losing his job as the coach of the Dolphins comes to mind quite prominently. But this particular situation, if Staley lost his job, despite his excellent coaching for parts of this year, it would be fair. Because again, in week 3 against these same Jaguars, Justin Herbert was in the game down 38-10 starting a drive with about 3 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. I don't have the words to properly express how stupid and indefensible that is, and a lot of people, including me, reacted to that viscerally with anger. And Staley did not learn. He didn't learn. Putting people in meaningless games when there is little to no upside, despite the importance of those players, and not learning from your mistake, will eventually come back to haunt you. And it looked early in the week like the Chargers had dodged a bullet, like Mike Williams was going to play. But come game time, it was not to be. Again, as I've talked about recently, I'm not someone who really enjoys going after coaches. There are human questions beyond job performance that need to be taken into account. But on the other hand, unfortunately, there are 32, just 32, NFL jobs in the world and only 32 offensive coordinator jobs, which we'll get to in a second. But this is a unique opportunity. You make millions of dollars a year to coach football at the highest level. The standard is equally high. And as much as we want to blame Staley, and we should, for this Chernobyl-sized collapse in the second half, at the end of the day, between the two of them, Joe Lombardi is absolutely more to blame for this total and complete collapse. The reason being, when you have a 27-0 lead as the offensive coordinator, it is your job to create enough rushing success to be able to control the clock. And again, the Chargers didn't have the Indianapolis Colts offensive line in this game. They weren't a complete disaster. In fact, the only guy who was missing from the offensive line that started the year was Rashawn Slater. And obviously, he's their best offensive lineman. He's a tremendous presence. But it's not as if Salyer, despite his leg being slightly compromised in this game, it's not as if Salyer is a disaster. At the end of the day, there are so many things creatively that Lombardi could have done and that weren't done. They could have used some design rollouts and Herbert runs. And again, I understand trying to protect your quarterback, but this is a win or go home scenario. Herbert has the ability to get good yardage rushing, as he proved a couple times in this game. Not using that option at all is, again, a complete creative failure. And it does have to be acknowledged, the Chargers could definitely have used a power back option in this game. They don't have that. That's a hole in their roster that needs to be addressed this offseason if possible. But it doesn't excuse the lack of creativity in Lombardi's inability to get any sort of rushing traction whatsoever, and it led to the Chargers eventually losing control of the game. Joe Lombardi, as an offensive coordinator, is creatively bankrupt. That's the bottom line. And because that's a bottom line, he has to go. It's another bottom line for you. And I'm sure it's not just Chargers fans that feel this way either. I'm sure that NFL people around the league are also thoroughly tired of seeing Justin Herbert's production and the offense's production in general capped below where it could be because of Lombardi's inability to come up with creative ways to maximize it. As soon as the Jaguars scored their offensive touchdown at the end of the first half, you could feel the momentum of the game shifting, especially out of halftime, and the Chargers were never able to regain control of the game. They couldn't get consistent stops. They couldn't stop the Jaguars from getting pressure on the quarterback. There was no ability to creatively run the ball and get the clock moving in the Chargers' direction. And that is coaching more than anything else. There is no scheming in the run game that would allow the Chargers to be able to take advantage of the Jaguars' over-aggression. It was just a complete and total coaching failure in the second half. And on the other side, a brilliant coaching success from Doug Peterson, it has to be said. He did an amazing job with keeping his team engaged down 27-0. They clearly never stopped believing. They were able to get the crowd back into the game in the second half. It's just a masterclass as far as keeping your team together and focused and leading with an ultimate lack of panic, which obviously trickled down to the players and affected their performance in a positive way. The defense stayed aggressive, didn't play with fear, and even though I don't agree with the call that Peterson made on the two-point conversion, going for it, when the downside is you then are forced to get a touchdown rather than having the option to kick a field goal to stay in the game, but it worked out as big dick aggression sometimes does, and certainly Doug Peterson could easily be accused of that on a consistent basis. And the last thing that I wanted to point out as a congratulatory element to the Jaguars, Travis Etienne, when he beat Asante Samuel Jr. around the edge and is able to get that first down on 4th and 1, is so present and so intelligent in that moment that he not only stays in bounds and gets some extra yards, he ensures that the Jaguars have control of the clock and can end regulation on their terms. It was a tremendously intelligent maneuver. So let's move this thing forward a little bit. Let's say, as many Charger fans are clamoring for, let's say you want to try to acquire Sean Payton from the Saints. It's obviously going to take a lot in terms of draft picks. The Saints, I'm sure, would probably let him go, especially if Payton puts pressure on the Loomis ownership in New Orleans. But even though the Chargers have the assets to be able to make this kind of acquisition, some questions remain. The first major point revolves around Chargers owner Dean Spanos, who is notoriously cheap in the eyes of Chargers fans, especially those who are left over from San Diego and lived through the Qualcomm Stadium and new stadium fiasco. But he does have different revenue streams now in LA. So even though there's no salary cap on coaching, will he be willing to shell out the amount of money it's going to take to acquire a coach that's going to be in as much demand as Sean Payton is likely going to be, even though Payton has expressed interest in the Chargers job for Justin Herbert reasons and for geographic reasons? LA is a great place to coach. And then there's also the second question in this situation. How much control would Sean Payton personally want over the personnel of the team that he was going to join? Would he want Tom Telesco fired? Would he want to be the GM? Would he want to have a GM that he enjoys installed in his place? How much control would he want? And of course, he will have the ability to kind of call his own shot in this particular scenario. He's going to be in tremendous demand, both because of his success and his ability to turn an offense from mediocre into great. So at the end of the day, it all really comes down to this. Even if the Chargers decide to get rid of Staley and hopefully Lombardi. Certainly Lombardi has to go regardless, as we've talked about on the channel for a long time now. But we still have to keep in mind as Charger fans these couple of important takeaways. One, the Chargers special teams, despite Dicker unfortunately missing a very key 40-yarder down the stretch of this game, the Chargers special teams is the best special teams unit that I remember the team having in many years. They actually won them a game against the Broncos. They had a turnover in this game as Jasir Taylor was able to recover a fumble. This team has a brilliant special teams coach. There's no doubt about it. So losing him would be a loss. I would try to retain him at any reasonable cost. And then also, there's a ton of uncertainty even if the team was going to relieve the coaches of their duties. So it has a lot to do with ownership, how the coaching market develops as the season goes on. So if the Chargers were to let him go, he would have his pick without a doubt of any defensive coordinator openings in the league, period. And honestly, there might be a couple of teams who would even want him as their head coach, would want to give him a second shot. And the reality is this: if you look at the totality of his tenure in LA, he obviously made a bunch of mistakes. And I think that he, as a young coach, when he's a bit older, he will look back on this season especially and say, I was not cognizant enough of the downside risks of playing my players in situations where there was a chance of injury. He did it in week 3, he did it in week 18, and one of the times it really came back to bite him in the ass. One of the ESPN pundits said something I think very fair the other day, which is that Staley has a tremendous tolerance for his players' pain. These guys are human beings, and they will always want to play. You as the coach have to be the responsible one in the room. That's why you're the head coach. That's why you're vested with that amount of decision-making power. You have to be better in terms of decision-making, especially with regard to health, than Staley was this year. And it very well might cost him his job. And again, it isn't extraordinarily unfair, despite Staley's successes for a lot of this year. There's a high standard in the NFL. That's just how it goes sometimes.
On your mark, get set, go.